Welcome to this review of our planned and prepared planet, and to part 3, Scientific Objections to Darwin's Origins. As a reminder, in part 2, we reviewed what Darwin said in his book Origin of Species about the difficulties and problems with his theory. We remind ourselves that Darwin stated in his 4th edition that the great majority of naturalists believe that species are immutable productions and have been separately created. This view has been ably maintained by many authors. As we will note later, there were many evolutionary theories that preceded Darwin's origins. We record some of the naturalists, who were later called scientists, and their views on evolution, and especially those who opposed Darwin's ideas in Origins. We begin with Edward Blyth, 1810 to 1873, who was a zoologist. He wrote 3 articles on variation, discussing the effects of artificial selection and describing the process in nature, which is now called natural selection, as restoring organisms in the wild to their archetype rather than forming new species. These articles were published in the Magazine of Natural History between 1835 and 1837. In the first chapter of On the Origin of Species, Darwin wrote, "Mr. Blyth, whose opinion, from his large and varied stores of knowledge, I should value more than almost anyone." In a 1959 paper, Loren Eiseley claimed that the leading tenets of Darwin's work, the struggle for existence, variation, natural selection, and sexual selection, are fully expressed in Blyth's paper of 1835. Next we come to Robert Chambers, 1802 to 1871, Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, FGS, LLD. He was a publisher and geologist. He wrote Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation and published it in 1844 as a work of natural history and philosophy, bringing together various ideas of evolution with the transmutation of species plus numerous scientific theories of the age. Here we show Chambers' diagram from the first edition of Vestiges, which shows a model of development where fish, F, reptiles, R, and birds, B, represent branches from a path leading to mammals, M. Thus we note that Darwin's tree was not the first representation of species change. The unstated implications of men from monkeys was already controversial from Vestiges. Because of the controversy, Darwin held back his similar view until he published The Descent of Man in 1871. According to the historian James A. Secord, Vestiges outsold Origins up until the early 20th century. Next we come to Adam Sedgwick, 1785 to 1873. He was a geologist and one of the founders of modern geology. He taught geology at the University of Cambridge and was tutor to Darwin. He proposed the Cambrian and Devonian period of the geological timescale, and he opposed Darwin's theory. Sedgwick said that accepting Darwin's evolutionary ideas threatened to sink the human race into a lower grade of degradation than any into which it has fallen since its written records tell us of its history. In his letters to Darwin, 24th of the 11th, 1860, he said, "Many of your wide conclusions are based upon assumptions which can neither be proved nor disproved. Why then express them in the language and arrangements of philosophical induction?" And then again, in a letter of the 2nd of January, 1890, he said to Darwin, "Your theory is utterly false. It repudiates all reasoning from final causes, and seems to shut the door on any view, however feeble, of the God of nature as manifested in his works. From first to last, it is a dish of rank materialism, cleverly cooked and served up. Next, we turn to Professor Fleming Jenkin, 1833 to 1885, FRS, FRSE, LLD, who was Regius Professor of Engineering at the University of Edinburgh. In his review of The Origin of Species in the North British Review, number 46, June 1867, pages 277 to 318, he says, "We are asked to believe all these maybes happening on an enormous scale, in order that we may believe the final Darwinian maybe as to the origin of species." The general form of his argument is as follows: all these things may have been, therefore my theory is possible, and since my theory is a possible one, all those hypotheses which it requires are rendered probable. There is little direct evidence that any of these maybes actually have been. A plausible theory should not be accepted while unproven, and if the arguments of this essay be admitted, Darwin's theory of the origin of species is not only without sufficient support from evidence, but it is proved false by a cumulative proof. Darwin admitted that the critique by Professor Fleming Jenkin was the most valuable he had ever read on the origin of species. Next, Edward D. Cope, 1840 to 1897. He was an American zoologist and paleontologist. From his Essays on Evolution, 1887, page 2, he says, "In the first place, Darwin's demonstration contained in The Origin of Species extends little further than as stated in the title of his work. He proves little more than that species of the same genus or other restricted groups have had a common origin, and, further, his theory of natural selection is to the plainest understanding incomplete as an explanation of their origin, as its author indeed freely allows." Page 15. "Great obscurity has arisen from the supposition that natural selection can originate anything, and the obscurity has not been lessened by the assertion often made that these variations are due to inheritance." Next, Professor Richard Owen, 1804 to 1892, anatomist and paleontologist. In his review of origins in the Edinburgh Review, 1860, he says, "Mr. Darwin asks, how is it that varieties, which I have called incipient species, become ultimately good and distinct species? To which we rejoin with a question: do they become good and distinct species? Is there any one instance proved by observed facts of such transmutation? We have searched the volume in vain for such. When we see the intervals that divide most species from their nearest congeners, in the recent and especially the fossil series, we either doubt the fact of progressive conversion, or, as Mr. Darwin remarks in his letter to Dr. Asa Gray, one's imagination must fill up very wide blanks. Next, Alfred Russel Wallace, OM, FRS, 1823 to 1913. He was a land surveyor, naturalist, geographer, anthropologist, and biologist. Wallace was the co-author with Darwin of the theory of evolution, and it has been suggested that Darwin got some of his inspiration from Wallace. Darwin wrote about Wallace. The third volume of the Journal of the Linnean Society contains papers read July 1st, 1858, by Mr. Wallace and myself, in which, as stated in the introductory remarks to this volume, the theory of natural selection is promulgated by Mr. Wallace with admirable force and clearness. Wallace, writing to his friend Henry Walter Bates about evolution in the mid-1840s: "I have rather a more favourable opinion of the vestiges than you appear to have. I was not satisfied with the more or less vague solutions at that time offered, that I believed the conception of evolution through natural law so clearly formulated in The Vestiges to be, so far as it went, a true one. Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation by Robert Chambers, we referred to earlier, was a work of natural history and philosophy. Wallace wrote, "These extracts from my early letters to Bates suffice to show that the great problem of the origin of species was already distinctly formulated in my mind, that I was not satisfied with the more or less vague solutions at that time offered." Quotations from Wallace's book My Life, 1905, page 16. The chief differences of opinion between Darwin and myself. As this subject is often referred to by objectors to the theory of natural selection, and it is sometimes stated that I have myself given up the most essential parts of that theory, I think it will be advisable to give a short statement of what those differences really are, and how they affect the theory in question. Our only important differences were on 4 subjects, which may be considered separately. Number 1, the origin of man as an intellectual and moral being. On this great problem, the belief and teaching of Darwin was that man's whole nature, physical, mental, intellectual, and moral, was developed from the lower animals by means of the same laws of variation and survival, and, as a consequence of this belief, that there was no difference in kind between man's nature and animal nature, but only one of degree. My view, on the other hand, was, and is, that there is a difference in kind, intellectually and morally, between man and other animals. Number 2, sexual selection through female choice. Number 3, Arctic plants in the southern hemisphere. 4, pangenesis and the heredity of acquired characters. Darwin always believed in the inheritance of acquired characters, such as the effects of use and disuse of organs and of climate, food, etc., on the individual, as did almost every other naturalist, and his theory of pangenesis was invented to explain this among other effects of heredity. I therefore accepted pangenesis at first, because I have always felt it a relief, as did Darwin, to have some hypotheses, however provisional and improbable, that would serve to explain the facts, and I told him that I shall never be able to give it up till a better one supplies its place. I never imagined that it could be directly disproved, but Mr. Francis Galton's experiments of transfusing a large quantity of the blood of rabbits into other individuals of quite different breeds, and afterwards finding that the progeny was not in the slightest degree altered, did seem to me to be very nearly a disproof, although Darwin did not accept it as such. But when, at a much later period, Dr. Wiseman showed that there is actually no valid evidence for the transmission of such characters, and when he further set forth a mass of evidence in support of his theory of the continuity of the germplasm, the better theory was found, and I finally gave up pangenesis as untenable. We should look at Wallace's book for details of his 4 points. We note that Francis Galton was the cousin of Darwin, and he is chiefly remembered for introducing the term eugenics and for his enthusiastic promotion of selective breeding in human populations. Eugenics has been described as science's greatest scandal and is linked to Darwin's theory. It was welcomed by dictators in the 1930s with their extermination of so-called undesirables. The same thinking pervades societies today, with designer babies and abortion of unborn babies, especially those with Down syndrome. A really greater killing machine than all the world wars put together. Wallace regularly urged Darwin to jettison the term selection as misleadingly anthropomorphic, and to substitute Herbert Spencer's survival of the fittest. Darwin went halfway. In later editions he added, or survival of the fittest, to natural selection, in the title of chapter 4, We should note that anthropomorphic means attributing human qualities to God. By 1866, Wallace had changed his mind and pointed out to Darwin that natural selection does not so much select special variations as exterminate the most unfavourable ones. He also said, the survival of the fittest is really the extinction of the unfit. Wallace criticised Darwin's views and declared that all creatures and plants had been designed. Wallace also rejected Darwin's use of domesticated animal breeding as a proof for the operations of natural selection. From New Thoughts on Evolution, being the views of Dr. Alfred Russel Wallace, as gathered in an interview by Harold Begbie with Mr. Wallace. Well, it is the very simple, plain, and old-fashioned one that there was at some stage in the history of the earth, after the cooling process, a definite act of creation. Something came from the outside. Power was exercised from without. In a word, life was given to the earth. All the errors of those who have distorted the thesis of evolution into something called, inappropriately enough, Darwinism, have arisen from the supposition that life is a consequence of organization. This is unthinkable. Life, as Huxley admitted, is the cause and not the consequence of organization. Admit life, and the hypothesis of evolution is sufficient and unanswerable. Postulate organization first, and make it the origin and cause of life, and you lose yourself in a maze of madness. An honest and unswerving scrutiny of nature forces upon the mind this certain truth, that at some period of the earth's history there was an act of creation, a giving to the earth of something which before it had not possessed, and from that gift, the gift of life, has come the infinite and wonderful population of living forms. Wallace said, I believe it to be the guidance of beings superior to us in power and intelligence. Call them spirits, angels, gods, what you will. The name is of no importance. I find this control in the lowest cell. The wonderful activity of cells convinces me that it is guided by intelligence and consciousness. I cannot comprehend how any just and unprejudiced mind, fully aware of this amazing activity, can persuade itself to believe that the whole thing is a blind and unintelligent accident. It may not be possible for us to say how the guidance is exercised, and by exactly what powers. But for those who have eyes to see and minds accustomed to reflect, in the minutest cells in the blood, in the whole earth, and throughout the stellar universe, our own little universe, as one may call it, there is intelligent and conscious direction. In a word, there is mind. Wallace continues, but we must enlarge our vision. We must see more beings in the universe than ourselves. I think we have got to recognize that between man and the ultimate God, there is an almost infinite multitude of beings working in the universe at tasks as definite and important as any that we have to perform on the earth. I imagine that the universe is peopled with spirits, that is to say, with intelligent beings with powers and duties akin to our own, but vaster, infinitely vaster. I think there is a gradual ascent from man upwards and onwards, through an almost endless legion of these beings, to the first cause, of whom it is possible for us to speak. Through him, these endless beings act and achieve, but he himself may have no actual contact with our earth. Begbie said, but in any case, you believe that there is purpose in creation? Wallace replied, it meets me everywhere I turn. I cannot examine the smallest or the commonest living thing without finding my reason uplifted and amazed by the miracle, by the beauty, the power, and the wisdom of its creation. Have you ever examined the feather of a bird? I almost think a feather is the masterpiece of nature. No man in the world could make such a thing, or anything in the very slightest degree resembling it. Someone has said that a single feather from a heron's wing is composed of over 1,000,000 parts. The quill is socketed, held together by little contrivances in the nature of hooks and eyes. It is of a material so light that a finger can twist it out of shape. But if it gets pierced or separated by any slight blow, it becomes quickly reunited and restored. Watch a bird sailing high above the earth in a gale of wind, then remind yourself of the lightness of its feathers. And those feathers are airtight and waterproof, the perfectest venture imaginable. Have you ever thought of this too? The loveliest and most grateful thing on the earth is unquestionably a bird. I suppose everybody has felt that. One cannot watch the flight of the least of birds or study the wonders of their plumage without feeling a quite intense admiration. They are exquisite creations. Well, all the beauty is in the feathers. Strip a bird of its plumage, and what was the perfectest thing becomes at once the most ugly and comical. A young bird makes us laugh. When its feathers have grown, the same bird makes Shelley write an immortal ode. Such is the wonder of feathers. And how do they grow? Evolution can explain a great deal, but the origin of a feather and its growth, this is beyond our comprehension, certainly beyond the power of accident to achieve. Alfred Wallace, writing in Quarterly Review, April 1869. We must therefore admit the possibility that in the development of the human race, a higher intelligence has guided the same laws for noble ends. Such, we believe, is the direction in which we shall find the true reconciliation of science with theology on this most momentous problem. Let us fearlessly admit that the mind of man, itself the living proof of a supreme being, is able to trace, and to a considerable extent has traced, the laws by means of which the organic, no less than the inorganic world, has been developed. But let us not shut our eyes to the evidence that an overruling intelligence has watched over the action of those laws, so directing variations and so determining their accumulation, as finally to produce an organization sufficiently perfect to admit of, and even to aid in, the indefinite advancement of our mental and moral nature. Wallace again writing, Darwinism on exposition of the theory of natural selection with some of its applications. We thus find that the Darwinian theory, even when carried out to its extreme logical conclusion, not only does not oppose, but lends a decided support to, a belief in the spiritual nature of man. It shows us how man's body may have been developed from that of a lower animal form, under the law of natural selection, but it also teaches us that we possess intellectual and moral faculties, which could not have been so developed, but must have had another origin, and for this origin we can only find an adequate cause in the unseen universe of spirit. Now, Wallace was not a Christian, but he referred to creation and a higher and overruling intelligence in his assessment of the world. But he was sidelined by the main body of the scientific community, who wanted no opposition, no design, and no intelligence, just mechanistic materialism. Darwin's copy of Wallace's book is marked with a triple underlined "No," and with many notes of exclamation. Darwin wrote to Wallace, April 14, 1869, I presume that your remarks on man are those to which you alluded in your note. If you had not told me, I should have thought that they had been added by someone else. As you expected, I differ grievously from you, and I am very sorry for it. I can see no necessity for calling in an additional and proximate cause in regard to man, but the subject is too long for a letter. I have been particularly glad to read your discussion, because I am now writing and thinking much about man. From The World of Life by Wallace, a manifestation of creative power, directive mind, and ultimate purpose. That like produces like, that offspring are like their parents. This is so common, so well known to everybody, so absolutely universal in ordinary experience, that we are only surprised when there seems to be an exception to it. In its wider sense, as applied to species, there are no exceptions. Not only does the acorn always produce an oak, the cat a kitten, which grows into a cat, the sheep a lamb, and so throughout all nature, but each different well-marked race also produces its like. Next, we refer to Gregor Mendel, 1822 to 1884. He was founder of the modern science of genetics. He was an Austrian monk who discovered the basic principles of heredity through experiments with pea plants in his garden. Mendel studied botany under Franz Unger, who had begun using a microscope in his studies, and who was a proponent of a pre-Darwinian version of evolutionary theory. Though Mendel's experiments had been conducted with pea plants, he put forth the theory that all living things had such traits. He said, "My scientific studies have afforded me great gratification, and I am convinced that it will not be long before the whole world acknowledges the results of my work." Unfortunately, his work was not recognized until decades after his death. It should be noted that his work was often marginalized by Darwinians, who claimed that his findings were irrelevant to a theory of evolution. It may be that Darwin knew of Mendel's work, but didn't pay any attention to it because of its mathematical content. Darwin once said that mathematics in biology was like a scalpel in a carpenter's shop. There was no use for it. He obviously didn't like mathematics, probably because it was too difficult for him. We note, usually we like what we can do. Mendel's research conclusions left no room for blending inheritance that Darwin believed to occur. Next, we refer to William Whewell, 1794 to 1866. He was a mathematician and science historian who coined the term scientist in 1833. He wrote History of the Inductive Sciences from the earliest to the present time in 1837, which Darwin credited with contributing to the scientific method he used. On 2nd of January 1860, Whewell wrote to Darwin to acknowledge receipt of his copy of the first edition of On the Origin of Species. He wrote, "My dear Mr. Darwin, I have to thank you for a copy of your book On the Origin of Species. You will easily believe that it has interested me very much, and probably you will not be surprised to be told that I cannot, yet at least, become a convert to your doctrines." Next is Ernst Haeckel, 1834 to 1919. He was a German zoologist, naturalist, eugenicist, philosopher, who discovered, described and named thousands of new species, mapped a genealogical tree relating all life forms. He altered embryo drawings to support his now discredited evolutionary recapitulation theory. Haeckel also championed Darwin's cause in German. In 1864, Haeckel wrote to Darwin, "The best of Germany's youth were committed to Darwinism. Thus the ground was prepared for Hitler's extermination policies. The spread of the survival of the fittest doctrine influenced other dictators." Next we refer to Charles Lyell, FRS, 1797 to 1875. He was a Scottish geologist and professor of geology at King's University, London. He is best known as the author of Principles of Geology. From his book, Concluding Remarks, page 798, we are prepared, therefore, to find that in time also the confines of the universe lie beyond the reach of mortal ken, that is, knowledge. But in whatever direction we pursue our researches, whether in time or space, we discover everywhere the clear proofs of a creative intelligence and of his foresight, wisdom, and power. To assume that the evidence of the beginning or end of so vast a scheme lies within the reach of our philosophical inquiries, or even of our speculations, appears to be inconsistent with a just estimate of the relations which subsist between the finite powers of man and the attributes of an infinite and eternal being. So we note that both Wallace and Lyell considered that theistic, intelligent evolution was the only satisfactory answer that they found in the evidence. We come now to William Thomson. He was a physicist, and in 1862 calculated that the planet was unlikely to be more than 100 million years old, which was insufficient time for evolution to have acted. Darwin wrote to Wallace in 1869, "Thomson's views on the recent age of the world have been for some time one of my sorest troubles." Further studies, including one by Darwin's son George, an astronomer, fixed the Earth's age at under 100 million years. William Thomson later became Lord Kelvin. So we note that the calculation of the Earth's age has been gradually increased and is now claimed to be 4.5 billion years based on the theory of uniformitarianism. That is, conditions have stayed the same since the world began, which is a huge assumption and cannot be proved. Question is, are these calculations correct? Doubt has been expressed on their accuracy. We remember that science is always changing. What was believed in the past is, based on the record, likely to change in the future. We come now to Samuel Butler, 1835 to 1902. He was a novelist and critic. From his book, Luck and Cunning as the Main Means of Organic Modification, published 1887. In the preface, he says, "In the course of writing, I became more and more convinced that no progress could be made towards a sounder view of the theory of descent until people came to understand what the late Mr. Charles Darwin's mindless theory of natural selection amounted to, and how it was that it ever came to be propounded." In chapter 13, Darwin's claim to descent with modification, he writes, "Mr. Allen, in his book, Charles Darwin, says that in the public mind, Mr. Darwin is commonly regarded as the discoverer and founder of the evolution hypothesis." And so on page 177, he says that to most men, Darwinism and evolution mean one and the same thing. Mr. Allen declares misconception on this matter to be so extremely general as to be almost universal. This is more true than creditable to Mr. Darwin. Mr. Allen says that though Mr. Darwin gained far wider general acceptance for both the doctrine of descent in general and for that of the descent of man from a simious, i.e. monkey-like or semi-simious ancestor in particular, he laid no sort of claim to originality or proprietorship in either theory. This is not the case. No one can claim the theory more frequently and more effectually than Mr. Darwin claimed descent with modification, nor, as I have already said, is likely that the misconception of which Mr. Allen complains would be general, if he had not so claimed it. In The Origin of Species, Darwin begins, "When on board HMS Beagle, as naturalist, I was much struck with certain facts in the distribution of the inhabitants of South America and in the geological relation of the present to the past inhabitants of that continent. These facts seem to me to throw some light on the origin of species, that mystery of mysteries, as it has been called by one of our greatest philosophers. On my return home, it occurred to me in 1837 that something might perhaps be made out of this question by patiently accumulating and reflecting upon all sorts of facts but could possibly have any bearing on it. After 5 years' work, I allowed myself to speculate upon the subject and drew up some short notes. These I enlarged in 1844 into a sketch of the conclusions which then seemed to me probable. From that period to the present day, I have steadily pursued the same object. I hope may be excused these personal details, as I give them to show that I have not been hasty in coming to a decision." So Butler comments, "This is bland, but peremptory. Mr. Darwin implies that the mere asking of the question how species has come about opened up a field into which speculation itself had hardly yet ventured to intrude. It was the mystery of mysteries. One of our greatest philosophers had said so. Not one little feeble ray of light had ever been thrown upon it. Mr. Darwin knew all this, and was appalled at the greatness of the task that lay before him. Still, after he had pondered on what he had seen in South America, it really did occur to him that if he was very, very patient, and went on reflecting for years and years longer upon all sorts of facts, good, bad, and indifferent, which could possibly have any bearing on the subject, and what fact might not possibly have some bearing, well, something, as against the nothing that had been made out hitherto, might by some faint, faraway possibility be one day dimly seen. It was only what he had seen in South America that made all this occur to him. He had never seen anything about the descent with modification in any book, nor heard any one talk about it as having been put forward by other people. If he had, he would, of course, have been the first to say so. He was not as other philosophers are, so the mountain went on for years and years gestating, but still there was no labour. It will be observed that not only is no hint given here that descent with modification was a theory which, though unknown to the general public, had been occupying the attention of biologists for 100 years or more, but it is distinctly implied that this is not the case. When Mr. Darwin said it was conceivable that a naturalist might arrive at the theory of descent, straightforward readers took him to mean that though this was conceivable, it had never, to Mr. Darwin's knowledge, been done. If we had a notion that we had already vaguely heard of the theory that men and the lower animals were descended from common ancestors, we must have been wrong. It was not this that we had heard of, but something else, which, though doubtless a little like it, was all wrong, whereas this was obviously going to be all right. To follow the rest of the paragraph with the closeness that it merits, this would be a task at once so long and so unpleasant that I will omit further reference to any part of it except the last sentence. That sentence runs, "In the case of the mistletoe, which draws its nourishment from certain trees, which has seeds that must be transported by certain birds, and which has flowers, with separate sexes, absolutely requiring the agency of certain insects to bring pollen from one flower to the other, it is equally preposterous to account for the structure of this parasite, with its relations to several distinct organic beings, by the effects of the external conditions, or of habit, or of the volition of the plant itself. Doubtless, it would be preposterous to refer the structure of either woodpecker or mistletoe to the single agency to any one of these three causes, but neither Lamarck nor any other writer on evolution has, so far as I know, ever contemplated this. The early evolutionists supposed organic modification to depend on the action and interaction of all three, but I venture to think that this will ere long be considered, as to say the least of it, not more preposterous than the assigning of a largely preponderating share in the production of such highly and variously correlated organisms as the mistletoe and woodpecker, mainly to luck, pure and simple, as is done by Mr. Charles Darwin's theory. It will be observed that in the paragraph last quoted from, Mr. Darwin, Morcio, in his usual way, is careful not to commit himself. All he has said is that it would be preposterous to do something the preposterousness of which cannot be reasonably disputed. The impression, however, is none the less effectually conveyed that some one of the three agencies, taken singly, was the only cause of modification ever yet proposed, if, indeed, any writer had ever gone so far as this. We knew we did not know much about the matter ourselves, and that Mr. Darwin is a naturalist of long and high standing. We naturally, therefore, credited him with the same good faith as a writer that we knew in ourselves as readers. It never so much as crossed our minds to suppose that the head which he was holding up, all dripping before our eyes as that of a fool, was not that of a fool who had actually lived and written, but only the figure of a straw which had been dipped in a bucket of red paint. Naturally enough, we concluded, since Mr. Darwin seemed to say so, that if his predecessors had nothing better to say for themselves than this, it would not be worthwhile to trouble about them any further, especially as we did not know who they were nor what they had written, and Mr. Darwin did not tell us. It would be better and less trouble to take the goods with which it was plain Mr. Darwin was going to provide us, and ask no questions. We have seen that even tolerably obvious conclusions were rather slow in occupying to poor, simple-minded Mr. Darwin, and it may be sure that it never occurred to him that the British public would be likely to argue thus. He had no intention of playing the scientific confidence trick upon us. I dare say not, but unfortunately the result has closely resembled the one that would have ensued if Mr. Darwin had had such an intention. The claim to originality made so distinctly in the opening sentences of The Origin of Species is repeated in a letter to Professor Haeckel, written October the 8th, 1864, and giving an account of the development of his belief in descent with modification. This Darwin's letter, part of which is quoted by Mr. Allen, is given on page 134 of the English translation of Professor Haeckel's History of Creation, and runs as follows. In South America, 3 classes of facts were brought strongly before my mind. Firstly, the manner in which closely allied species replace species in going southward. Secondly, the close affinity of the species inhabiting the islands near South America to those proper to the continent. This struck me profoundly, especially the difference of the species in the adjoining islets in the Galapagos archipelago. Thirdly, the relation of the living Edentata and the Rodentia to the extinct species. I shall never forget my astonishment when I dug out a gigantic piece of armour like that of the living armadillo. Reflecting on these facts, and collecting analogous ones, it seemed to me probable that all allied species were descended from a common ancestor. But during several years I could not conceive how each form could have been modified so as to become admirably adapted to its place in nature. I began, therefore, to study domesticated animals and cultivated plants, and after a time perceived that man's power of selecting and breeding from certain individuals was the most powerful of all means in the production of new races. Having attended to the habits of animals and their relations to the surrounding conditions, I was able to realize the severe struggle for existence to which all organisms are subjected, and my geological observations had allowed me to appreciate to a certain degree the duration of past geological periods. Therefore, when I happened to read Malthus on population, the idea of natural selection flashed on me. Of all minor points, the last of which I appreciated was the importance and cause of the principles of divergence. So Butler says, this is all very naive, and accords perfectly with the introductory paragraphs of The Origin of Species. It gives us the same picture of a solitary thinker, a poor, lonely, friendless student of nature, who had never so much as heard of Buffon, Erasmus Darwin, or Lamarck. Unfortunately, however, we cannot forget the description of the influences which, according to Mr. Grant Allen, did in reality surround Mr. Darwin's youth, and certainly they are more what we should have expected than those suggested, rather expressly stated, by Mr. Darwin. Everywhere around him, says Mr. Allen, in his childhood and youth, these great but formless, why formless, evolutionary ideas were brewing and fermenting. The scientific society of his elders and of the contemporaries among whom he grew up was permeated with the leaven of Laplace and Lamarck, of Hutton and of Herschel. Inquiry was especially everywhere rife as to the origin and nature of specific distinctions among plants and animals. Those who believed in the doctrine of Buffon and of the Zoomania, and those who disbelieved it alike, were profoundly interested and agitated in soul by the far-reaching implications of that fundamental problem. On every side, evolutionism in its crude form. I suppose Mr. Allen could not help saying in its crude form, but descent with modification in 1809 meant, to all intents and purposes, and was understood to mean what it means now, or ought to mean to most people. The universal stir, says Mr. Allen on the following page, and deep prying into evolutionary questions, which everywhere existed among scientific men in his early days, was naturally communicated to a lad born of a scientific family and inheriting directly in blood and bone the biological tastes and tendencies of his grandfather, Mr. Erasmus Darwin. I confess to thinking that Mr. Allen's account of the influences which surrounded Mr. Darwin's youth, if tainted with picturesqueness, is still substantially correct. On an earlier page he had written, "It is impossible to take up any scientific memoirs or treatises of the first half of our own century without seeing at a glance how every mind of high original scientific importance was permeated and disturbed by the fundamental questions aroused, but not fully answered, by Buffon, Lamarck, and Erasmus Darwin. In Lyell's letters and in Agassiz's lectures, in the Botanic Journal, in the Philosophical Transactions, in treatises on Madeira beetles and on the Australian flora, we find everywhere that the thoughts of men profoundly influenced in 1,000 directions by this universal evolutionary solvent and leaven." And so Butler continues, "And while the world of thought was thus seething and moving restlessly before the wave of ideas set in motion by these various independent philosophers, another group of causes in another field was rendering smooth the path beforehand for the future champion of the amended evolutionism. Geology on the one hand and astronomy on the other were making men's minds gradually familiar with the conception of slow natural development, as opposed to immediate and miraculous creation." From chapter 15, The Exercised Minds, page 202. This view derives confirmation from the fact that in 1869, with the 5th edition of The Origin of Species, there was a stampede of mice throughout the whole work, no less than 30 out of the original 45 being changed into the, our, this, or some other word, which, though having all the effect of my, still did not say my outright. From chapter 18, Per contra, that is, on the contrary, page 243. Did the world give much heed to or believe in evolution before Mr. Darwin's time? Certainly not. Did we begin to attend and be persuaded soon after Mr. Darwin began to write? Certainly yes. Did we err long over en masse? Assuredly. If, as I said in Life and Habit, anyone asks who taught the world to believe in evolution, the answer to the end of time must be that it was Mr. Darwin. And yet the more his work is looked at, the more marvellous does its success become. It seems as if some organisms can do anything with anything. Beethoven picked his teeth with the snuffers, and seemed to have picked them sufficiently to his satisfaction. So Mr. Darwin, with one of the worst styles imaginable, did all that the clearest, tersest writer could have done. Strange that such a master of cunning, in the sense of my title, should have been the apostle of luck, and one so terribly unlucky as Lamarck, of cunning, but such is the irony of nature. Buffon planted, Erasmus Darwin and Lamarck watered, but it was Mr. Darwin who said, "That fruit is ripe," and shook it into his lap. We next come to Sir James Hopwood Jeans, OM.FRS, 1877 to 1946. He was an English physicist, astronomer, and mathematician. He said, "The stream of knowledge is heading towards a non-mechanical reality. The universe begins to look more like a great thought than like a great machine. Mind no longer appears to be an accidental intruder into the realm of matter. We ought rather hail it as the creator and governor of the realm of matter." James Jeans in The Mysterious Universe. Next we come to Cyril Darlington, 1903 to 1981. He was a biologist, geneticist, and eugenicist, who carried out research showing that chromosomes are responsible for carrying hereditary information. He was professor of botany at the University of Oxford in the 50s and 60s, and a Darwinian. In his book, Darwin's Place in History, page 60, he described Darwin, and this is paraphrased, as a slippery character whose veracity and intellectual integrity was not to be trusted. From Darlington's book, Darwin's Place in History, chapter 7, page 33. In the first edition of The Origin, Darwin had given the impression that the problem of evolution first came to his notice on the voyage of the Beagle, and that this was the beginning of his own ideas on the subject. Naturally, his critics seized upon this apparent misrepresentation, and in his third edition, 1861, Darwin wrote an historical sketch. Butler described this essay as meagre and slovenly. Its stilted phrases read indeed like an unhappy confession. It was also a gravely misleading confession. In this sketch, Darwin gives a slight account of Lamarck. To his grandfather Erasmus, however, he refers only in a footnote. It is curious, he writes, in a more unusually awkward phrase, how largely my grandfather, Dr. Erasmus Darwin, anticipated the erroneous grounds of opinion and the views of Lamarck. He had already excused this unfortunate view in a letter to Huxley, written in June 1859, with the phrase, "The history of error is unimportant." From page 56 of Darlington's book, the radical advances in knowledge brought about by the Mendelian experiment and by the use of the microscope, and most recently by organic chemistry, reveals endless new connections bearing on the theory of evolution. Before these advances had been made, within the classical framework of observation and inference, to which Darwin confined himself, no revolutionary ideas were possible beyond what was implied by natural selection and hard heredity, and all these implications had been made clear before the Beagle set sail. From pbs.org about origins. Although the tone of the statement seems to become more positive in later editions, the change of thought indicates a certain inability of the original theory to stand up to criticism. Comparison of the 6 editions of Origins reveals a definite change in Darwin's theory. In the last 2 editions, non-selective forces come into play. Darwin was unwilling to admit a great structural change in his theory, and although all the factors had been presented in earlier editions, the importance of their role had so shifted by the 6th edition that it is difficult not to conclude that the basic axioms of the theory had changed. A quote from the Guardian newspaper, 21st of January 2009. Evolution. Charles Darwin was wrong about the tree of life. Evolutionary biologists say crossbreeding between species is far more common than previously thought, making a nonsense of the idea of discrete evolutionary branches. Charles Darwin's tree of life, which shows how species are related through evolutionary history, is wrong and needs to be replaced, according to leading scientists. The naturalist first sketched how species might evolve along branches of an imaginary tree in 1837, an idea that quickly came to symbolize the theory of evolution by natural selection. But modern genetics has revealed that representing evolutionary history as a tree is misleading, with scientists saying a more realistic way to represent the origins and interrelatedness of species would be an impenetrable thicket. Darwin himself also wrote about evolution and ecosystems as a tangled bank. From the website of the Royal Society in London, New Trends in Evolutionary Biology, Biological, Philosophical and Social Science Perspectives. Scientific Meeting, November 2016. An overview. Developments in evolutionary biology and adjacent fields have produced calls for revision of the standard theory of evolution, although the issues involved remain hotly contested. All macroevolutionists should take note of this and change their theory to conform to the latest research, because the original evolutionary theory and the so-called watertight case is in fact leaking, because it has always been full of holes. Many evolutionary scientists over many years think so, and that is why this meeting was arranged. We refer now to Darwin's follow-up book to Origins, which was entitled The Descent of Man. And quoting from the Daily Mail, Mail Online, 21st of May 2021, like so many of the scientific tomes of Darwin's day, the book offers a racist and sexist view of humanity, says Princeton University anthropologist Augustine Feintz. Writing in Science, Feintz accuses the famed British naturalist of letting racism, sexism, and misogyny warp the scientific process and influence his findings. However, some of Darwin's other assertions were dismally and dangerously wrong. Dissent is a text from which to learn, not to venerate. Dissent is often problematic, prejudiced, and injurious, he wrote. Feintz said Darwin thought he was relying on data, objectivity, and scientific thinking when describing human evolutionary outcomes. But a lot of the book, like other scientific tomes of the day, was problematic by modern standards. It offers up a racist and sexist view of humanity that portrays anybody but white European men as less than or of lower rank than other races. Darwin portrays indigenous people of the Americas and Australia as being less than Europeans in capacity and behaviour. Feintz wrote, "When it came to people from Africa, Darwin consistently referred to them as cognitively deoperate, that is, stunted growth and capacity, less capable and of a lower rank than other races." He said in the book, Darwin twists over himself to continue to push his baseless assertion of evolutionary differences between races. As well as describing non-white men as less than, Darwin also used natural selection to place women lower in rank than white men. In Descent, Darwin identified women as less capable than white men, often akin to the lower races, Feintz added. Darwin said in Descent, "At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, anthropomorphous apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, even than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian Aborigine and the gorilla." It's on page 336. Stephen Jay Gould, 1941 to 2002, was a Marxist Harvard professor and evolutionist. He stated, "Biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1850, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory." That's from his book Ontogeny and Phylogeny. Professor Dennis Noble from Oxford, writing in The Music of Life, referred to Shapiro's book Evolution, A View from the 21st Century, 2011, page 144. Quotes, "Selection never produced a new species as Darwin theorized. Selection purifies but does not create. Are mutations random? It is difficult, if not impossible, to find a genome change operator that is truly random in its action within the DNA of a cell where it works." It's page 82. He goes on to say, "Are gradual accumulations of mutations the cause of speciation? The answer is no. The 2001 Nature report of draft human genome, 2 proteins did not evolve 1 amino acid at a time. Domains shifted. Mutations are not random. Proteins did not evolve via gradual mutations. Thousands of years of domestic breeding produces new varieties but not new species. Environment-induced changes can be inherited. Darwin's tree of life is a network or series of bushes." Professor Noble and many other scientists have produced a new website called The Third Way of Evolution. Here are some quotes from their website. All the central assumptions of the modern synthesis, often also called neo-Darwinism, have been disproved. Moreover, they have been disproved in ways that raise the tantalizing prospect of a totally new synthesis. From Physiology is Rocking the Foundations of Evolutionary Biology, page 1235. This website is dedicated to making the results of that research available and to offering a forum to expose novel scientific thinking about the evolutionary process. The DNA record does not support the assertion that small random mutations are the main source of new and useful variations. We now know that many different processes of variation involve well-regulated cell action on DNA molecules. The website, therefore, intends to present a wide variety of novel views about evolution, but does not necessarily endorse any of them. Our goal is simply to make a new thinking about evolution available in one place on the web. So are you surprised that Darwin's theory was not accepted by many scientists, and yet was popularized and treated as factual, being presented as being complete, yet had so many unanswered questions and problems? In reality, it turns out to be a deception, as Darwin deceived himself and many others. Over the last 30 years or so, Darwin's theory of natural selection with random mutation has been shown by scientific experiment to be unworkable and incorrect, just as predicted by Wallace and others in the 1860s. The claim by evolutionists that their theory is scientific has been shown to be false. Research has shown not only the complexity of observable life, as Darwin noted, but also the extremely complex digital code in every living cell, which operates like a factory. So Darwin worked with supposition, inferences, and conjecture. He proposed natural selection as the replacement impersonal creator, such that creatures and plants can recreate themselves. Would the real creator create random chance? Where are all the trillions of intermediate life forms in the fossil record? Darwin ended his origins with this quote from Francis Bacon in his Advancement of Learning. To conclude, therefore, let no man out of a weak conceit of sobriety or an ill-applied moderation think or maintain that a man can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's word or in the book of God's works, divinity or philosophy, but rather let men endeavour an endless progress or proficiency in both. Ironically, in contrast to X-Club's atheistic publicity of Darwin's time, Darwin then declared, "There is a grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one." It should be noted it takes more faith to believe in an impersonal and undirected force than it does to believe in a personal designer-creator. Modern science investigations confirm design in the DNA of all living creatures, including earthworms, C. elegans, which are transparent, just 1 millimeter long, and are more complicated than a modern mobile or cell phone. 3 men were awarded the Nobel Prize for their research into these creatures, working from a single cell up to the fully grown adult. There was, once again, no credit for the designer and creator. We should note that neo-Darwinism extends further back from Darwin's initial creation position to the beginning of the first unknown life on the planet, and then applies the alleged mechanism of natural selection. But natural selection, by definition, has to start with something, when in fact there was nothing. So it appears that by some magical undirected chance, non-life produces life. In all these opposing views, we must quote Francis Bacon, who said, "Men believe what they prefer."